welcome to today's lecture series, the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies Tuesday noon lecture series. We'd like to welcome you to our sixth presentation in our virtual noon lecture series. And just so that you know, the complete series schedule and previous recordings of previous talks are available on the China Center's websites, and we will be sending out email reminders weekly. We begin today's lecture with an announcement. Our next presentation in the LRCCS Noon Lecture Series will take place on Tuesday, November 3rd, and will be given by Christian DePay, Associate Professor of History at the University of Michigan, who will be speaking on the city in present tense, writing the urban landscape in 11th century China, and that will be next week. So without further ado, I am very pleased to welcome Natsu Oyobe, who is our Curator of Asian Art at the University of Michigan's Museum of Art. She specializes in modern and contemporary Japanese art and has curated numerous Japanese art exhibits, including Wrapped in Silk and Gold, a family legacy of 20th century Japanese kimono, Turning Point Japanese studio ceramics in mid-20th century, and Mari Katayama. Dr. Oyobe is also involved in cross-cultural projects from a variety of historical periods, including Isamu Noguchi and Baishi, Beijing 1930. As well as Weixin's Monumental Portraits and Copies and Invention in East Asia that was exhibited in 2019. She also served as the consulting curator for the Detroit Institute of Art's New Japan Gallery in 2016-2017, and Dr. Oyobe earned a PhD in art history from the University of Michigan in 2005. Today, she will be speaking on Monumental Friendship, Chinese ceramics in the James Marshall Plumer Memorial Collection at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thank you, Twyla. Let's share my screen first. Okay. So I'd like to express my really sincere gratitude to the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and Twyla for inviting me to talk today. And this is really great opportunity to share some of the really remarkable collection of our museum's Chinese ceramics. So let's see. Okay, in 1964, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, henceforth I would say UMA, held an exhibition of the James Marshall Plummer Memorial Collection. The exhibition was to introduce the collection established in memory of the University of Michigan's professor of East Asian Art, James Marshall Plummer, who died in 1960. It is consisted of more than 100 objects. The majority were objects collected by Plummer, which were donated or purchased from his family. Yet another part of the collection was gifts from his friends and former students, which attested a fascinating network of scholars, collectors, and artists Plummer developed between 1930 and 1960 through his research of Zhang and Yue wares, experience as a monument man in the occupied Japan of the post-World War II, and teaching at the University of Michigan. In this talk, I will highlight the Chinese ceramics in the Plummer collection and illuminate his remarkable scholarship and humanism that connected the people of diverse backgrounds from China, Japan, and the US. And I want to give you some disclosure that due to the closure of Bentley Historical Library until recently, I was able to view only a portion of his archival materials. My talk today scratches only the surface of Plummer's vast research and networks. Also, I hope that this talk encourages some of the audience who knew James Marshall Plummer to share their stories about him and his collection with me, like ceramic artist Mary Wu, whom I hope joining today, recently gave a wonderful story about her relationship with Plummer. So today's talk, I will try to cover, first introduce James Marshall Plummer and his memorial collection, and also, and in relation to his collection, his connections and networks. And I will talk mainly about Chinese ceramics, but also touches on objects of other media and cultures. James Marshall Plummer was born in 1899 at Newton Center, Massachusetts, and received Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard College in 1921. In 1923, Plummer was hired by the Chinese Maritime Customs Service as an administrative officer and stationed in Nanjing, Mukden, or present-day Shenyang, Shanghai, Fuzhou, and Hankou. The when and whereabouts of Plummer's service were very clear until the summer of 1928, as he was regularly sending letters to his mother until then. These are all kept at the Bentley Historical Library among James Marshall Plummer papers. It's also clear that he was in Fuzhou from 1932 to 33 and Shanghai from 1933 to 37. From the Maritime Customs Service staff lists kept among his papers. You can see Plummer's name on this list. And under the station, it says SUL, which means he's on leave on this particular year. In China, he took intensive language courses and mastered the Chinese language. And on the right, you see the certificate of his language proficiency. During the 15 years of employment, he was allowed quite frequently to take leaves for study in US, teaching, and research. He studied under historian archaeologist Langdon Warner at Harvard University, while also teaching Chinese language. As some of you might know, that Warner is said to be one of the models of Indiana Jones, and he has had a mixed reputation as a router of the Dunhuang caves, but at the same time, savior of Japan's Odo capitals, Kyoto and Nara, from US bombing. In China, he researched all kiln sites, which led to the discovery of some period Jianware kiln site in the northeastern area of the Fujian province in 1935, and Yueware kiln sites near Ningbo in the Zhejiang province in 1937. These sensational discoveries made young Plummer recognized as one of the foremost authorities of the study of Chinese ceramics. In 1936, Plummer became professor of Far Eastern art at the University of Michigan. Between 1942 and 44, he served as director of the China unit of the Army Map Service at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Between 1948 and 49, he went to Japan to become Fine Arts Advisor of the United States Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Historic Monuments in War Areas, a group commonly known as Monuments Men, and assessed the condition of cultural properties around Japan. And this is diary in Historic Library. And you can see his very busy schedule. I just, typed out some of them. So on this particular week, he was in Nara in Japan, Nara, old capital. And in the next page, this is from 1949. He was in Kyushu and visiting temples and private collections. So then he taught at the University of Michigan until his death in 1960. His main research focus was Song Dynasty Chinese ceramics, but like Langdon Warner and other Asian art specialists at that time, His interest was wide in chronology, geography, and media. Also, his interests were shifted according to his professional circumstances between 1930 and 1960 as civilian specialist working for the US government's war effort and post-war peacekeeping. In 1 year's class listing, probably in the 1950s, he taught Indian art, Chinese ceramics, Japanese art, and Asian religious art. In the classroom, he put great emphasis on study of objects. His office was located inside Alumni Memorial Hall, the neoclassical style building of the Art Museum. So my virtual background right now, which his students called, quote unquote, a class, study, seminar, gallery, storage room. His students were taught to intensely and inquisitively study objects, which often included those from his collection. One of Plummer's students, Sherman Lee, the influential director and curator of Cleveland Museum of Art, remembered, quote, his large collection was used and reused until we knew the pieces blindfolded. Literally so, for often one was required to identify ceramics beneath a cloth by feel alone, end quote. Now let's look at the Plummer Memorial Collection. So there are two parts of the collection. One is the objects collected by Plummer himself and donated or sold to UMA by his wife Caroline and children. And other is those donated by his friends and colleagues. The majority of Plummer's objects were acquired in the 1920s and 30s while he was working at the customs service in China. Plummer probably began collecting soon after he started working in the Shanghai office in 1923. In his frequent letters to his mother, the occasional descriptions of artworks he saw were reporting that he visited some curio shops. So in this slide, you see on the left, mirror in a collection. And on the right, his letter to his mother. And there's a illustration very similar to this mirror in our collection. He also traveled to Japan and probably to Korea, which was under Japan's colonial rule during that time, and purchased art objects there too. It's fascinating to compare his collection with those of other contemporary collectors in the US. Avery Brundage, the former chairman of International Olympic Committee, collected Chinese and other Asian artworks with standpoint of aesthetic and technical merits that pleased him. And as some of you might know, that his collection became the founding collection of San Francisco's Asian Art Museum. But because of his anti-Semitist and racist remarks and activities, the museum recently removed his statue from the museum building and tried to sort of deassociate, with his name. Sherman Lee purchased works for aesthetic, but also historical importance appropriate for large city museums, like Seattle Art Museum, Asian Art Museum, and Cleveland Museum of Art, where he worked as a curator or director. Most of Plummer's collection is smaller size, as they are meant for study and not for display. And in these slides, you see examples from these three collections, and Brundage and the Sherman Lee's, purchase usually very large and very sort of flashy type. For Plummer, the varieties are important rather than a few superb quality pieces, and there's a great emphasis on objects used by those who are not social elites. In his review of the Plummer's collection exhibition at DIA, Detroit Institute of Art, Plummer's colleague and professor of South Asian art, his art history, Walter Spink, described Plummer's collecting in this way. Quote, the material shown suggesting Professor Plummer's deep and wide-ranging interests. None of the items was grand in scale. Only a few were very well known. Yet taken all together, they formed a group of clear significance. Obviously, he was in no way concerned with collecting signed works. All were the products of unknown artists. Anyone who remembers how Professor Plummer looked at objects, felt them, and felt about them would understand that for him, the character of the piece itself was its proper signature, and signature enough, end quote. Plummer's wide interest is reflected in his collection, which includes bronzewares, jades, wood, and metal sculpture, paintings, and prints. Because this talk today's talk is focusing on ceramics, I'm not going into details of other types of objects. But for example, the collection of Buddhist sculptures is historical and regional representations in mind. And in general, they're small and probably used by non-elite worshippers. Here I also included Guanyin sculpture from DIA's collection. It was originally in the Plummer collection. And the next one, this terracotta botte plaque is in our collection, and we have about 10 of these. Among nearly 200 objects of the Plummer collection at UMA, about 150 objects are ceramics and 120 of them are Chinese. They include Han Dynasty mortuary objects, remarkable variety of Tang Dynasty jars, such as this elegant proto-porcelain white glazed jar. The collection is strong in the wares of Song and Yuan dynasties, but not many representations of Ming and Qin dynasties. Plummer's Chinese ceramic collecting is very systematic in green glazed ware, or more commonly known as celadon. There's this jar from Han Dynasty, stoneware with partial transparent olive green glaze, prototype of future green glazed ware. You can see these sort of clear greenish, clear glaze on about the top of this jar. And then there are several lotus jars from the 6 dynasties and Tang Dynasty. In Song Dynasty, the green glazed ware reached the first pinnacle with Yue and Longchang wares. This Yue ware, broken half container lid with molded dragon motif, was found by Plummer in the Yue ware kiln waste in 1937. Although it is broken, the container lid, probably made for the imperial court, is considered one of the most important pieces in UMA's Plummer collection for the aesthetic and historic significance. In the 12th century, Yue ware was gradually replaced by Longchang ware, which has more opaque, evenly applied glazes. The green glaze collection also goes beyond the Chinese border and has several elegant examples of inlaid celadon wares from the Goryeo dynasty in Korea. So I will talk more about Chinese ceramics collection in relation to his gallery and artistic network later. So he played a very important role in communities which surrounded him. And I say communities in many different levels and with various constituents. So first of all, there was a community of scholars from North America, Asia, and Europe. From letters and newspapers clippings preserved in the museum and also Bentley, we can see that he was constantly invited to give lectures in universities and museums around the nation. Plummer was considered an East Asian art authority next to Langdon Warner, who was a definite leader of the field in the US. Plummer sometimes substituted Warner for giving lectures. When Warner's memorial, Warner passed away in 1955, I believe. And so Warner's memorial was elected at Horyuji Temple in Japan in June of 1958. Plummer went there as a representative of 3 institutions, the University of Michigan, the Fogg Art Museum, Harvard University, and the Freer Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian. In addition, Plummer served as curators or lent objects from his collection to exhibitions at numerous museums. Through his connections, many distinguished guests visit Ann Arbor, including Ananda Kumaraswamy, curator of South Asian art at Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and also Japanese philosopher Yanagi Muneyoshi. There was also a community of collectors. Most of them had interest in Asian art and culture from the pre-war period. And many of them lived in Ann Arbor area at some point in their lives, including Willard and Maribel Hanna, who donated UMA many rare Chinese New Year prints, such as these on the screen right now. Plummer served as an advisor to these people. His fame attracted art dealers, including C.T. Liu, who was a major dealer of Chinese and Indian art in the first half of the 20th century, and Frank Carroll, who succeeded Liu's operation. Plummer also created a community of practicing ceramic artists, mentoring them by sharing his research of ceramics and showing his collection. His home was like a salon, inviting these artists and students to touch and actually use by serving tea with his collection of sewn ceramics. UMA curator Paul Grigaud appropriately called Plummer a guru for his students and artists. Ceramic artist Mary Wu, who recently received the Kresge Eminent Artist Award, considers Plummer as her early mentor. She said, quote, "James Plummer was my mentor who opened my eyes to Asian art and culture. He was so generous and took an interest in me, always inviting me to tea and learning much about Chinese ceramics. He discovered the Tenmoku, well, I usually say Jan Kiln in this context, but so a Tenmoku Kiln site in 1935. I learned about Japanese monks traveling to Tianmunshan Zen temples in Fujian, coveted Tenmoku bowls for tea ceremony. I loved his many stories of the East, and I'm sure he enjoyed having an eager listener," end quote. In a more official level, he was one of the important members of civilian specialists in the US government. Because of his experience in China, he worked in the government's map service during the war with Japan, and then during the immediate post-war World War II period, worked to assess conditions of cultural properties in occupied Japan. During this period, his relationship with Japan deepened, and because of that, he was actively involved in the Center for Japanese Studies within the University of Michigan. Plummer in this photo is the front row, fourth person from the left, James Blasher Plummer. And but I should also mention that the Center for Chinese Studies was not established until 1961, 1 year after Plummer's death. So in these communities, Plummer was respected not only for his scholarly achievements, but also for his generosity and genuine sense of humanism. Harold Philip Stern of the Freer Gallery described Plummer's humanistic side in the obituary. Quote, "James Plummer was a person of great warmth and kindness. He treated all his fellow men with equality, just as he loved not only fine porcelains, but also tea ceremony and peasant wares of coarse and gritty clay. The laborer, beggar, and thief, as well as the scientist and scholar, were respected by him," end quote. In the photo books from his China years, there are many pictures of ordinary people in towns and countryside. This portrait of a beggar is one example. In his acknowledgement of the Zhang Wei book, Plummer thanks to a list of people who helped him during the kiln research. from his superior at the Shanghai Customs Service, who gave him special leave, to innkeepers, ferrymen, bus drivers, farmer guys, and also coolies. His central position in these diverse communities were most remarkably reflected in the part of the James Marshall Plummer Memorial Collection donated by his friends and colleagues. In June 1960, Plummer suddenly died while he was in his summer home in Concord, New Hampshire. This was a great shock to the communities that Plummer was part of, and UMA's director, Charles Sawyer, and curator Paul Grigaud conceived a plan to call for his friends to donate artworks commemorating his life and achievements. To this request, the gifts came between 1961, a year after he died, until most recently in 2003. The last few donations were to honor both Plummer and his wife, Caroline. In the end, there are 12 donors who donated 25 objects. Sorry. A fellow professor of the History of Art department, Walter Spink, and his wife Nesta Spink donated a few South Asian paintings, including the spoke painting of the epic depicting the epic Mahabharata. Professor Spink actually passed away last year, and just recently, Nesta also passed away, and that's to our greatest sadness. Among other donors were scholars and curators of East Asian art, including Sherman Lee, John A. Pope, he's a specialist of Chinese ceramics and director of the Freer Gallery, Harold Philip Stern, curator and later director of the Freer Gallery. There were Plummer's former students too, such as John Maxson, specialist of Italian painting and vice president of Art Institute of Chicago, and Mira Mihao, Japanese art historian who taught at Vanderbilt University. There are also well-known collectors, such as Harry Packard, collector and dealer of Japanese art, whose collection later entered the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and George Bickford, collector of South Asian art, whose collection is now at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Each of these people selected artworks which relate to Plummer's scholarly interests or something evocative of his personality. An interesting example is gifts of blue and white porcelain wares donated by 3 donors of diverse backgrounds and collecting interests. Each of them selected blue and white ware from their collections to honor Plummer. They probably thought that because of Plummer's preference in monochrome ware of Tang and Song dynasties, the collection lacked the presence of blue and white ware, which was flourished in China and beyond in the Ming and Qing dynasties. John Pope donated this magnificent ewer made in Jindajiang in the early 15th century. Harry Packard, collector of Japanese art, donated an early 17th century blue and white ware plate from Hizen, Japan. And then Reverend Philip Schenk donated a Korean blue and white vase from the Joseon period. These collectors' gifts could be their own interventions to Plummer's collection. So for the rest of my talk, I'd like to focus on the connection he developed around Jiangware, whose kiln sites Plummer discovered in 1935, and made his reputation really shot up in the international community of Chinese ceramic historians. The Plummer collection has varieties of Jiangware balls and shards produced in the kilns near the village of Shuiji in northern Fujian, a major tea growing region in China. He also had the similar types, now grouped together as Tenmoku ware from Jizhou, and also the northern Tenmoku from Honan. The terminology of Chinese wares is often very confusing, as there are Chinese terms derived from specific locations and Japanese tea ceremony terms, which refers to stylistic types. In general, janware is a black glazed ware produced in jan kilns in Shuiji. Tenmok refers to black glazed ware produced in various locations, including Jizhou and Honan, or even Korean Goryeo and Japanese Seto. Plummer's posthumous publication with janware research is titled Tenmok. And when he was in the Fuzhou Customs Office in 1932 and 33, he found black glazed tea bowls in local antique stores and began to suspect that these were found not too far from Fuzhou. And in 1935, when he was in the Shanghai office, he took 28 days of research leave trying to locate kilns of these black glazed wares. This adventure of maneuvering floods, overflowing rivers, imminent dangers of bandit and communist activities is really well recorded in the London Illustrated News article and his book. So in this map, this is a map drawn from his Tenmok book, Janware book. So he started in Shanghai, and then the yellow line is a route that he took for the excavation research. And he went through Tiamu Mountain and then arrived at Shuji on the red square, and finally arrived at Fuzhou. At that time in China, excavations and research of historic ceramic kiln sites were conducted by researchers of the United States, Europe, and Japan. Through his research, Plummer became a close friend with Japanese ceramic historian Koyama Fujio. Koyama himself became a star after he found the kiln sites of dinware and published it in 1941. So at the Uma in the Chinese gallery, so there's a white dinware bowl on the left, and the Tenmoku janware tea bowl in the middle, and also actually dinware, black dinware, also from the Plummer collection on the right. So these are really, displayed really beautifully together right now. So instantly, Koyama visited Ann Arbor in 1957 and saw more than 350 bowls and few thousand shards at Uma's storage and Plummer's home. In his publication of his own publication of Tenmokware, Koyama says that Plummer had the largest collection of janware in the United States. So after the war, Koyama emerged as the key person in Japan's effort to promote Japanese ceramics as an authentic art of the nation. Japan was interested in renewing its image as a nation of culture. Its long history of ceramic making and preservation was an ideal tool for the culture of diplomacy. Koyama curated international exhibitions of historic and contemporary Japanese ceramics and published books on them. In the 1950s, he was instrumental in designating contemporary potters for intangible cultural properties, or better known as living national treasures, and historic ceramics for cultural properties under Japan's new Cultural Properties Protection Law. Plummer's friendship with Koyama deepened during the time Plummer served as the Allied Forces Fine Arts Advisor between 1948 and 49. In 1958, when Plummer visited Japan for Langdon Warner's memorial, Koyama was one of the people who to welcome and also farewell Plummer at the airport. And probably it was Koyama who connected Plummer's wife, Caroline, with the Idemitsu Art Gallery and made the publication Plummer's janware research possible in 1972. So in this in Japanese called yosegaki, but people, put their signature, sort of proof that they are there, and give that to, people you're seeing off. Their names, Hamada Shoji and Kato Hajime, both were living national treasures of Cermix, and also Robert Hall, the founding director of CJS, and Mayuyama Junkichi, an art dealer. Through his research of janware, Plummer also became a close friend with Japanese potter Hamada Shoji in the pre-war time. And Hamada called his black and brown glaze Tenmoku glaze, and it is possible that Plummer gave Hamada some advice on the creation of the glaze. Hamada was a central figure in Japan's folk art movement, or Mingei Undo, and in 1952, Hamada traveled to US with Yanagi Muneyoshi and English potter Bernard Leach to give a lecture and demonstration. This tour is considered one of the most important events in the early post-war American ceramic history, impacted many American ceramic artists, including Peter Volkos and Rudy Autio. In addition to Los Angeles, Archibald Foundation in Montana, Black Mountain College in North Carolina, they also came to U of M, partly because of their connection with Plummer. So the photo on the left is Hamada demonstrating, and with Bernard Leach, who's on the left, supporting Hamada. And also Yanagi gave a lecture about Mingei, of folk art. And on the right is Hamada's large bowl. Now it's in our collection, but it was also in the Plummer collection. Plummer also advised collectors to acquire janware tea bowls. Henry Jewett and Bertha Green first met Plummer in Shanghai in 1935 through the introduction of Langdon Warner. In their collection, there are two janware bowls, as well as an oil spot black glazed tea bowl made by Henry and Bertha Green, which are now part of UMA collection. The Greens were amateur potter themselves, and in the 1950s, they studied under Hamada Shoji in Mashiko, Japan, which Plummer probably helped to initiate. This oil spot black glazed tea bowl was said to be fired in Hamada's kiln. Plummer also advised professional artists. John A. Foster, who worked as chief ceramics engineer at the Ford Motor Company between 1922 and 44, studied glazes of janware and other Chinese wares with Plummer. This connection with Plummer and Foster, I really want to research more because UMA has nearly 100 objects by John Foster. And many of them, just look at them differently in the styles of Chinese wares. So in this talk, I try to show Plummer's extensive network by way of his memorial collection at UMA. As I continue research and look deeper into this network, I want to keep following questions in my mind. In the 1930s, how did Plummer's status as an administrator of the customs service give him advantage for his research and collecting? His scholarly activities were clearly within the framework of America's colonial presence. And how do we tell the story, and what sort of actions do we need to take now? And also, who funded his research? The shipment of thousands of objects from China itself was an expensive endeavor. Also, in the post-war landscape of international politics and cultural diplomacy, what kind of roles Chinese specialists in the US, like Plummer, had? What happened to the rest of the Plummer's collection? And in this slide, you see on the right, on the top, is the image from Koyama Fujio's book, and showing really, many tea bowls at UMA's storage. And on the bottom is a tea bowl with this spurious inscription made in great stone during the year of Shande, shown there. And this and other tea balls with signature or some certain kind of marking, we don't have any of them now at UMA. So what happened to them? And we know that the Freer Gallery and other and Southeast Michigan institutions like Museum of Anthropological Archaeology and also DIA have portions of the collection, but where else? And how were they distributed? Did his friends get involved in this process? So some of these questions are very important to answer to understand the meanings of his collection for UMA. The University of Michigan and also beyond, especially when many art museums are trying to be more transparent in the collecting practice and also collection provenance of the past. So I'd like to close my talk by introducing UMA's Chinese ceramics collection as a whole. The remarkable collection of Plummer has made UMA's Chinese ceramic collection one of the strongest among university museums in the US. The reputation drew attention of other ceramic collectors, and UMA has had donations from collectors such as Domino's Pizza's founder, Tom Monahan, Zenobia M. Ping Lee, and also Juhua Lo Upshur. Most recently, William and Lin Weiss bequested UMA more than 1,000 pieces of Chinese decorative arts, a majority of which are ceramics. The Weiss collection is strong with Ming and Qing dynasty monochrome and blue and white wares, and it will complement the periods and styles that Plummer left off. In addition to the collection, they donated an endowment to establish a program dedicated to ceramic art, named William C. Weiss, MD, and Lynn Weatherby Weiss Endowment for Ceramic Arts. This program will support exhibitions, art commissions, educational programs, and scholarly research of ceramic art. I hope this program would help to promote global nature of ceramic art. And next spring, I would like to show selected pieces from the Weiss Chinese ceramic collection and UMA's collection, focusing on the circulation of blue and white wares. The museum is only open to university classes right now, but I look forward to welcoming you for the inauguration of the Weiss collection, which will be presented side by side with the Plummer and other outstanding collection of Chinese ceramics. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Natsu. That was such a wonderful presentation and introduction to some incredible pieces and fascinating collectors. So we now have some questions. It looks like we already have a few. And first of all, I'd like to ask Ian Shin. I will ask his question. He is not here, but he has left the question and is very interested in hearing your answer. He says, thank you for this beautiful presentation. Could you say more about Plummer's earliest encounters with Chinese art, and particularly what inspired him to start collecting while working for the Customs Service in the 1920s, and what his training at Harvard under Warner looked like? Was his model of training at U of M similar to or based on how he himself was trained by Warner?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think he was, he got interested in East Asian art during his undergrad years at Harvard. And before actually was hired by the Customs Service, he was traveling around the world. Actually, he didn't have much money. So he worked as, just out on a boat and ship, and he hopped from one ship to another. And finally, he reached to China. And I think that was when he was just graduated. So like he was 21 or 22 years old. And that really experience and his encounter with Chinese people really, left him great impression. So that's how he became very interested in Chinese culture. And I don't know much about, Warner's instruction at Harvard. That's something I want to learn more. But I know that Warner was like a consultant for many, several museums in US. So like, Nelson Atkins, Cleveland. So I'm sure that he was very keen on using objects, and make his students to learn from objects. So, but thank you for these questions.
Wonderful. So we have a question also from Anlin, who says the interconnections between Asian and Western artists and scholars of China and Japan are really interesting. She's wondering how post-war resentments between China and Japan, especially for Asian scholars, and also the US and Japan might have influenced this community of scholars, artists, and collectors. You portray so much communication and mutual respect in a period where resentments against the Japanese in the Republic of China and People's Republic of China, and resentments against American occupation in Japan must have been quite lively as well. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Mm, yeah, that's really, it's interesting. Um, and, you know, yeah, I think I think when I think that why Plummer sort of became distant a little bit from his research in China is because of the situation. There's really no way for him to revisit China. Um, so and also it was fascinating probably for him to see many Chinese art collections preserved in Japan. So that's something that really I want to learn more. Why he something like him. I mean, someone like him, have to really get into study of Japanese art. And yeah, and he cites some of the studies, more recent studies like 1950s, that many studies came from China. Chinese researchers started excavating these sites, which were really the research was dominated by Japanese and Americans and Europeans. So and he sees, although he just doesn't have direct connection, but he was able to read these new studies. So I think in that way he was still connecting with China, and that's something I really want to research more. Yeah, but thank you.
Great, thank you. Kevin Carr writes, thank you for this fascinating talk. I wonder if you could help me understand the apparent mismatch between the interests of present day collectors, artists, and scholars. It seems that in East Asia, ceramics are highly valued, but why isn't there more scholarly support, training, tenure track jobs, etc., for ceramic history today?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, I guess I like to return the question to you, Kevin. Maybe you can answer more. But when I look at the only what's happening at U of M, University of Michigan, that so unfortunately he passed away really when he was still young, quite young, 61 years old, and there's another China specialist, Max Lohr, who's really who has a general sort of a Chinese art specialist, but his attention I think went to paintings, and the scholars who trained under him also mostly I believe that painting specialists. So I think lots of attention. I mean, went to paintings and the study of so-called practical arts or decorative arts, really. didn't pick up, but I see more and more scholars recently specialize in ceramics. So I see that there's a great hope for that.
Great. Quick question from Nancy Yumala. Question about the origin of the contribution of the unglazed Chinese tower and farmyard assemblage at the museum, the Yuma.
Oh, sorry, what?
So there's apparently there's an unglazed Chinese tower and farmyard uh,
Oh,
ensemble.
yeah, watchtower, yes.
Yes, and she would like to know what the origin of that is.
Oh, so the tower and also several other objects like, several copies or models of like farm lives. Those are all burial objects. So those were buried with, people, and there was a sort of belief in afterlife. And even after you die, you will continue your life. So yeah, so that's why these kind of objects were made.
And where did they come from?
Where did it come from? Uh, in a particular area is
Yeah, yeah.
that question?
And were they also part of the Plummer collection?
Oh,
Or
sorry. Okay, no. Those are actually, I think the particular one was donated by the Domino's Pizza's founder, Tom Monahan.
wow.
Yes.
And do you know the region of China that it was collected from?
I don't know. There should be a record, but I can't remember just now.
Great. Okay, thank you. We have two more questions, and then I think we will need to stop. Um, so Fang writes, Dr. Ayobe, thanks a lot for the presentation. Have you encountered the name Chen Wanli in your research of Plummer's social network in China?
No, well, as I said, I really just began reading his materials. So if you, I guess I like to take notes of that name, and I want to ask you who that is. And yeah.
Great. Okay. And we have one more question. I'm going to put that into the chat box for you. And then these are questions from Katie Pritchard, and she wants to know what the impact of the acquisition of the artwork from the Plummer collection it was or is on the overall university museum collection, and what role do these artworks play in the current UMA collection?
Um, we actually have quite a few objects displayed, I mean, from Plummer collection displayed in the Chinese gallery. And I think I want to learn more. So some of, big portion of his ceramic shells are in Anthropology Museum. And so I really want to learn more why this particular group of objects went there, not at UMA. And something, I'm thinking there's a way to sort of, connect these, dispersed collections in one, and for, something available for future researchers.
And just a comment pertaining to that. So Carla Sinopoli, hi Carla, says thank you, Natsu, lovely to see you and revisit the Plummer materials at the UMA. And she notes that the Plummer collection in the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology numbers about 5,000 pieces, in addition to the ones at the Art Museum. And however, many of them are more fragments than whole vessels, but it would be very interesting to look at some of the combined collections.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Carla.
Okay, well, with that, I just wanted to remind everybody next week is Election Day. Please vote. And when you're not voting, or if you happen to be standing in line, or Please do come at noon, same place, same time, and we will see you for Christian DePay's talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.